At the end of another turbulent and volatile day in the financial markets, the sole cause of that volatility, Donald J. Trump. The Dow today falling more than 300 points. It began the day down about 1,200 points, only to rise briefly this morning and then drop again. According to the administration, that rally was based on a false social media post claiming that there could be a 90-day pause on all tariffs except for China. Once that false report was knocked down, the markets went back into the red. Donald Trump today threatening to impose more tariffs on China if China does not heal and back down on its retaliatory tariffs. In the Oval Office a few minutes ago, Donald Trump suggested that some tariffs that he imposed could be permanent. The turmoil underscores the fact that this crisis has been created by and is perpetuated by Donald Trump himself. CNBC is reporting this, quote, "This is the Trump recession." Those were the words of a U.S.-based chief executive officer in response to a flash survey CNBC circulated among members of its CEO council. Quote, "Disappointingly stupid and illogical" is how one CEO described the tariffs. Quote, "Without faith that our government knows what it is doing, it is impossible for businesses to thrive." Quote, "Trump has imposed tariffs on component parts that are simply unavailable in the U.S. and never will be. He has surrounded himself with an incompetent cadre of yes men and women, unable or unwilling to offer him cogent counsel." Said another. That is what the markets think of the Trump cabinet. That is why nothing that any of them has to say appears to have the ability to impact the market one way or the other, certainly to calm it. Here's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's appearance on Meet the Press.
As I just laid out at the top of the program, the markets lost more than $6 trillion in value. Was this disruption always part of the plan, Mr. Secretary?
Look, Chris, markets are organic, animals, and you never know what the reaction is going to be. One thing that I can tell you as the Treasury Secretary, what I've been very impressed with is the market infrastructure, that we had record volume on Friday, and everything is working very smoothly, so the American people can be very take great comfort in that.
Now, 68% said they were worried about the economy in one poll, and that was before the post-Liberation Day plunge in the markets. But for those of you worried about your savings or your 401k, Scott Bessent, who's worth $500 million, has this message for you.
What is your message to Americans who want to retire right now and who've just seen their lifetime savings drop significantly?
Well, Kristen, I think that's a false narrative. Americans who want to retire right now, the Americans who have put away for years in their savings accounts, I think they don't look at the day-to-day fluctuations of what's happening.
Scott Bessent thinks that people saving for retirement don't look. They just don't pay attention to their money on a day-to-day basis. Try hour by hour. False narrative. In other words, folks, do not believe your eyes, do not believe your ears. Right now, the problem for Trump is that no one's buying that, not even Trump's own supporters. One outspoken Trump ally, a hedge fund manager named Bill Ackman, is warning of a, quote, self-induced economic nuclear winter. Adding this, quote, business is a confidence game. The president is losing the confidence of business leaders around the globe. The consequences for our country and the millions of our citizens who have supported the president, in particular low-income consumers who are already under a huge amount of economic stress, are going to be severely negative. This is not what we voted for. A Trump-induced economic crisis leading to big cracks in the Trump coalition is where we start today. With me at the table, my friend and dear colleague, Steph Ruhle, co-host of the 11th Hour here on MSNBC, as well as an NBC News senior business analyst and anchor and correspondent for Bloomberg News, David Gura, who's been talking us through all of this, is here. Steph, I know you've been around the clock 24/7, but just pick up on this idea of Bessent appearing as a hostage might, not actually free to speak his mind.
Okay, can we just talk about Scott Bessent basically saying nobody's really looking at their 401k? When Scott Bessent took this job to be the Treasury Secretary, he sold his home in Charleston, South Carolina, I believe, for $30 million, right? Or right around there, the highest print of any home in Charleston. So sure, much like Howard Lutnick's mother-in-law, who a couple of weeks ago, he told us, listen, if she missed a Social Security check, she wouldn't be calling anyone. You're right, because you're worth $2 billion. Like, this is the consequence, right? When we were told this is the big business administration, we need to start treating our government, we need to operate our government like we do with business acumen. Well, now you have it. Big business guys, hugely wealthy guys in these hugely important jobs, saying something that is so far out of touch for where the American people are. And the whole thing we're seeing in the last 4 days with Scott Bessent is the White House is now making sure we know Scott Bessent's in the meeting. Scott Bessent is about to have a conversation with Japan. Why? Because right now they will do anything to earn back the trust of Wall Street. Because when Wall Street looks at the people who are speaking on behalf of Donald Trump, Peter Navarro, who wants these tariffs here permanently, okay, or Howard Lutnick, who's saying the exact opposite. And Howard Lutnick is saying, wait until the robots are producing everything here. Wait until you see what it's like when all those screws in an iPhone are being built in the United States. Any CEO, big or small, we're saying we're not bringing back that kind of manufacturing here. And for anyone in the true MAGA universe who's saying, well, the markets are not the economy, you're right, they're not. But look at almost any major financial institution out there, and what are they predicting? A recession. And a recession goes far greater than the market. That's going to impact almost every element of your daily life.
I mean, the problem with Bessent seems to be that no one, I have no idea who he was before he was picked. Steph said
he has a phenomenal reputation.
Wasn't as big of a lunatic as some of the other people around Trump. But the problem is he's not acting like the lesser lunatic. And that is my understanding of what's destabilizing.
Look at his appearance yesterday to Meet the Press, and Kristen Welker gave him many opportunities to explain what was happening here, to acknowledge the fact that this was an incredibly steep two-day sell-off at that point, which has continued into today, and he didn't do it. He was remarking on the fact that despite this massive sell-off, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the COVID pandemic, the pipes held up, the plumbing worked, and people were able to sell their stocks. It was kind of astonishing.
Like the lights stayed on?
The stock market worked when everyone wanted to sell. That was his argument.
That was the argument. And so I think that gets to what we just heard from the president as he spoke in the Oval Office. He says, essentially, trust me. This is important that we're doing this. The economic and market dislocation is a part of all of this, but it's going to pay out in the end. There are going to be golden days to come. And I think that you kind of see now, in broad strokes, the level of impatience with that from all manner of people. Yes, it's Bill Ackman, who runs a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. Yes, it's just a regular person who's wondering, why are we going through this? To your very good point, it's impossible to avoid how massive this sell-off has been and continues to be. And I think failing to acknowledge that and explain what's prompting it, what's catalyzing it, is becoming more and more problematic for the administration.
One of the things that never made sense to me ahead of the election is, watching the banks and the folks that the area you know really well seem indifferent top to bottom about autocracy. And you and I pursued some reporting about whether there were people in padded rooms who had to leave their phones, studying what happened in the first years of Putin 1.0 or Orban's first, I don't know, maybe 3-4 years. And folks swore up and down, no one's doing that. What are they doing now?
I'm so glad you asked me this, because when you were talking about that CNBC survey about one CEO said this and one CEO said that, do you know what the names of those CEOs are? You don't, because they were anonymous. And this is what is so scary about an autocracy. At a time of financial strain or crisis that we're facing right now, we would be hearing from CEO after CEO that's not afraid of wrath or vengeance from an administration, but they'd be speaking out on behalf not just of their shareholders, but giving their viewpoint of the global economy. Almost no one is speaking out because they fear the wrath of the president. If that doesn't make you afraid, and don't you think other countries are looking at this? Other countries that have been our longtime trading partners and allies are saying, we're watching a guy in the White House rule through executive order. So how can we trust the rule of law? Where is Congress? You're saying to companies, time to rebuild and start manufacturing here. Are you really going to approve a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing plant when an administration on any given day? Think about everyone who spoke on the Sunday shows yesterday. No one gave a cogent argument defending the tariffs. The most we heard was, you voted for Donald Trump. He's the president. He gets to do what he wants. He's the business guy. And I'll remind you, what he's the most successful at is politics, not business. As a business guy, he wasn't a good trading partner. He wasn't a good counterparty. It's why he was forced to do business with my alma mater, Deutsche Bank, because no U.S. bank would do business with him.